There are growing concerns over the accuracy and legitimacy of the 2020 census results. A new report reveals that supervisors in at least one California office have been instructed to prepare for additional layoffs, despite a U.S. District Court judge's temporary restraining order, which prevents the government from scaling back any ongoing census counting efforts. The order blocks the Trump administration's effort to wrap up the 2020 census count a month ahead of schedule. Before the coronavirus pandemic, the census was slated to conclude at the end of August, but because of person-to-person transmission of COVID-19, the deadline was pushed back to October 31st. Now the Census Bureau is concerned it will be unable to calculate the results of the count under the new extended timeline. Joining us now is Hansi Lo Wang. He's a national correspondent for NPR. Hansi, welcome. Thanks very much for joining us. A U.S. District Court judge has ordered the Trump administration to release all internal documents related to its decision to shorten the 2020 census window. Specifically, they're asking for all documents after April 13th. Why then, Hansi, and what are they looking for?
April 13th is when the Census Bureau and the Trump administration in general announced that they needed more time to conduct this national head count of every person living in the country because of the pandemic, that there were serious delays caused by the public health situation at that time. There were a lot of stay-at-home orders around the country, and the Census Bureau had made an assessment that it needed more time. And so it created this new extended schedule, which included continuing to count past September 30th through October 31st, and hoping that Congress would extend legal reporting deadlines for the results. The first one being December 31st, the latest state population counts that determine how many House seats each state gets. The Census Bureau said April 13th that they asked Congress to pass a new law to push back that deadline. And simultaneously, the Trump administration, through Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, who oversees the Census Bureau, and President Trump himself saying publicly that they supported this extended schedule at that time.
So then why is the administration trying to cut the census short, despite the ongoing issues caused by the coronavirus pandemic?
That's the question I've been trying to figure out. There was a mysterious about-face that apparently took place in late July when I broke the story that the Census Bureau had decided and started informing local offices around the country that door knocking, that because of the pandemic was originally extended to the end of October, was all of a sudden moved up to the end of September, cut short a month early, and with no reason given initially. And the Census Bureau ultimately, a few days later, confirmed that not only door knocking would end early, a month early, but all counting efforts, that the online form at my2020census.gov, the toll-free numbers that the call centers are receiving calls from, all of that ending September 30th, the Census Bureau said, because it had been directed by the Trump administration to end counting early in order to meet this current legal deadline of December 31st. What's interesting is that you have top-level career officials saying publicly since May that the Census Bureau could no longer meet that deadline, that December 31st deadline. Two top officials saying that publicly. And so it's really curious why the Trump administration made this internal assessment that they have not fully explained why they want to do this.
So, Hansi, taking a step back for just a moment, remind our viewers why the census is so critical here, because, it occurs to me when people hear some of this, they may not understand sort of the breadth and depth of the decisions that are made based on the information and the data that is actually gathered during the census. This is something I know, Hansi, you live, eat, and breathe census data. So why is this so important?
Elaine, this is about power. This is about money. I think one way to think about it is that even though the census does not get as much attention as the presidential election right now, the census results, this year's census results, are expected to determine the power that each voter has when the next presidential race is expected to occur. In 2024 and 2028, those presidential elections, the power that each voter has will be determined by the results of this census. That's the expectation. Why is that? The Electoral College. Let's not forget The U.S. president is elected not by the popular vote, by the Electoral College. How do we determine how many Electoral College votes each state gets? It's dependent upon the census. The census determines how many House seats each state gets, and based on the number of House seats, as well as the 2 by default Senate seats each state gets, that's how you figure out how many Electoral College votes each state gets. So this is all interrelated, and I haven't even talked about how this determines voting maps for the next 10 years, how this determines how $1.5 trillion a year in federal tax dollars for Medicare, for Medicaid, for other public services, how that money is distributed to local communities is dependent in part by census data.
Right. It is such a critically important part of how, in fact, that money and power, as you noted, are distributed in this country. Hansi, what about at the ground level here? Are there concerns that the U.S. Census Department might be putting some workers in harm's way by not fully complying with COVID-19 safety requirements? What can you tell us about that?
Well, the Commerce Department's Office of Inspector General, which is the internal watchdog group for the Census Bureau, has put out a memorandum saying that the Inspector General's office is concerned that the Census Bureau has not been fully complying with its own safety requirements for COVID-19. Specifically, the Inspector General's office says it's been receiving calls through its hotlines, allegations that workers at local census offices have not been wearing face masks while working inside, have not been keeping 6 feet of distance amongst workers, and also that there are workers who have tested positive, who work inside these offices, that have not been self-isolating afterwards. These all go against, according to the IG's report here, go against the Census Bureau's own safety guidance developed in concert with the Centers for Disease and Control, that guidance as well. And so there are concerns here that Census Bureau workers at these local offices are being put at risk. And what this means for the census is that if people's health are at risk and that they have to drop out because of health reasons, that might further reduce an already strained workforce to make sure there's a complete count of every person living in the country.
And Hansi, what's the bottom line here with respect to collection? You've got these legal developments happening, but the clock is ticking.
The clock is really ticking. And at this point, it's really hard to tell you what exactly the timeline is. One key date is December 31st. That's when the Census Bureau says that the end of door knocking, all the counting efforts had been set under this shortened schedule. And the Census Bureau's officials, career officials, have said that if these courts order the Trump administration as well as the Census Bureau to continue counting efforts past September 30th, the Census Bureau can no longer meet that December 31st legal deadline for reporting state population counts. The reason for that is because the Census Bureau says it has already shortened down the time for processing census results, to go through all the information it's collected this year, to look for any errors, any mistakes, any duplicate responses, making sure that every person who lives in the country is counted once, only once, and in the right place. All of that takes time to make sure that the information is combed through. And the Census Bureau says it's already shortened that time down to about 3 months. It cannot do that anymore. And doing that has already raised the risk of having serious errors in the count that the Census Bureau says it may not be able to fix.
Right, and any delay would really result in some ripple effects throughout the country. Hansi Lo Wang, really good to have you and your expertise. Thanks very much, Hansi.
You're welcome, Elaine.